Hello Year 10 students, this is Kamikaze. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats, strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flagged wave, first one way, then the other in a figure of eight, the dark shoals of fishes, flashing silver as their bellies swivelled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe. Yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. If we return to the top, the first thing to notice, the first line, her father embarked at sunrise, it immediately establishes a narrative perspective. In this case, we have a narrative voice speaking of a female voice and her father. We're told about what the father does. He is a kamikaze pilot, a man on a suicide mission. This is presumably World War II, and Beatrice Garland is deliberately creating this contrast between the old and the new in terms of the way that the kamikaze is described, and when, of course, it all happens. So it happens at sunrise, and that's significant because Japan is known as the land of the rising sun. So over here on the right hand side you have the national flag of Japan, and so by embarking at this particular time of the day, at sunrise, what we have is somebody who is moving at a time that is arguably sacred to the Japanese. Beatrice Garland is not Japanese, it's worth saying that right from the very beginning. She's just using this kind of story as inspiration and turning into poetry. That's what poets do. So, her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit. And what Garland does here is, as I say, create this contrast between the old and the new. To be a samurai is to be ancient, to be noble. It goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and yet we have this man in a cockpit. So the cockpit is demonstrative of this new modern world that the samurai find themselves in. The shaven head is synonymous with sacrifice, synonymous with sort of preparation and cleansing before one takes their own life. And that's sort of reinforced here in this description of a one-way journey into history. Perhaps more interesting than that, though, is the description of powerful incantations. To incant something is to sort of chant something in almost like a spell-like way. Arguably, religious prayers and so on, they can be considered incantations. And in this instance, the incantations are arguably a reference to the propaganda that has bewitched, that has enchanted this particular soldier into making him believe that what he is doing is right and just. As we move into the second stanza, but halfway there, she thought, it's interesting that there is this line break between the first stanza and the second, because the line break between them is arguably acting as this turning point in the father's thinking. We don't know it's the father's thinking, because the father, the soldier, the samurai, the man in the cockpit himself doesn't get a voice in the poem. Instead, it's the daughter's thinking. It's the daughter thinking of her father that maybe halfway there, that's maybe when he had his second thoughts. Because as she recounts the story to her children, she describes how her father, the man in the cockpit, must have looked far down at the little fishing boats, strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. And then as we move into the third stanza, it's kind of continuous. There are all of these continuous reasons. Note here there's a real absence of end stops or pauses at the ends of lines. This is called enjambment, as you know. And as I say, it's creating this sense of a really strong sense of a list of reasons building as to why this soldier decides to do what he does. And what he decides to do, of course, is to not complete the Kamikaze mission, to not do what it was that he was said to do. And maybe what we should really focus is on why. What is it that prompts him to not do that any longer? And what we have really throughout these two stanzas here, it's just numerous references to natural imagery. The little fishing boats, the green-blue sea, the dark shoals of fishes. All of these things combine to encourage the Kamikaze pilot to decide that what he is doing is wrong. And if we look at the language a little bit more specifically, what we have here is fishing boats strung out like bunting. Bunting is your triangular stuff, the little sort of banners that you put up for somebody's birthday party, or the Queen's 60th anniversary of her coronation, when everyone was having street parties a few years back. Bunting. And we've got fishing boats being described as celebratory. So these second and third stanzas are contrasting with the first stanza, because the first stanza is kind of brutal and pragmatic, functional language. And as we move into the second stanza, there is an increase. We've already discussed the list, but this increase in figurative and metaphorical language. There's the simile, strung out like bunting. This is continued with another simile, how it's the fishing boats which are arcing in swathes like a huge flag. We've got the description of how the fish are flashing silver. If we associate silver with wealth, then we're being told here by Garland that the natural world is our wealth. That is something that we should all be proud of, and something that we should all cherish and treasure. Those are the words I'm searching for. Cherish and treasure. And as we move into the next stanza, we've now got this movement towards nostalgia, and how the daughter assumes her father remembers his brothers waiting on the shore, and he has these nostalgic memories of childhood. And with memories, the memories of childhood, comes reasons to continue to have new memories, reasons to live. Building cairns of pearl grey pebbles. These are reasonably trivial things that people do. They're ultimately not terribly meaningful, but when the man is considering the act of taking his own life for some sort of grander political purpose, they are all the reasons that he needs to decide to not do it. As we then move on, we've got this description here of they want to bring their father's boat safe. And it's grandfather's boat. And these italics here are our first sort of overt intrusion of the daughter's voice, because the italics represent the daughter telling her children of her father. So that the family line is, we have Kamikaze pilot at the top, daughter who is telling of her father to her children. And that's what those italics are doing. They are the words of the daughter to her children, the pilot's grandchildren. Listen back to that quite carefully if you need to. And what do they want to do with the boat? They want to bring it back safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. So we're being told here about the kind of catch of the day and what the boat brings back. But perhaps more interesting is this kind of sensory language, the cloud-marked mackerel. It's telling us of their colour. It's grey, and the clouds are grey perhaps, but black crabs, feathery prawns. It's deliberately quite evocative. That's a lovely word, I think, evocative. Again, this reference to the colour silver and its associations with money once more, the loose silver of whitebait. So then as we move into the next stanza, we know from the previous lot of italics that these are perhaps the words. This is direct speech from the daughter of the pilot to her own children. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence. And as we listen to that, we really should be thinking to ourselves, crikey. The pilot has gone on a mission to take his own life for the good of the Japanese war effort. He decides to not do that because he sees the beauty of the natural world and realises that there's more to life and that he wants to live it. And as he returns home, his own wife doesn't speak to him ever again. She doesn't look him in the eyes. The neighbours don't either. Everybody treats him like he never existed. And so what we're being told about here is this deep sense of shame. The shame that society feels for the pilot because, in their eyes, he is dishonourable. He hasn't done what he was expected to do. He hasn't performed his duty. And so this poem is beginning to become much more interesting in its meanings because it's about the actions of the pilot. It's about the actions of the pilot and the impact on his relationships with his wife and his children and the rest of society. It's about the impact of his choice for individual self-preservation over patriotism. As I read this poem, I often think, is this guy doing the wrong thing? Should he have given his life to some supposed greater good? I'm not so sure, and I'm not sure Beatrice Garland is so sure either. It's perhaps a bit ambiguous. The only people, if we look into the last stanza, the only people who don't treat the pilot, their grandfather, with any sense of shame are the children. The children continue to chatter and laugh. Why? Because maybe they don't know any different. Children don't understand things until they get told. And that's why we have this line break again. Because within this movement from the penultimate stanza to the final stanza, there is this heavy pause. And perhaps this pause is mirroring the sort of length of time that it would take for the children to grow up and then gradually learn what the problem is. To learn why the grandfather is exiled, why he is made outcast in a society. So those children gradually learn to be silent. They also learn to live as though he had never returned. They learn to know that he is a father that they that they shouldn't love, that they no longer love. And I think that's a really interesting phrase because it rather tells us, hopefully the pink's a bit easier to read, pink purple, it rather tells us that these children are also sort of being indoctrinated. They are also being bewitched by the propaganda of their local community. This was no longer the father that we loved. They're telling us, we're being told, that they don't love him anymore. And that's staggering, isn't it? And therefore we have this sense of it building to these last two lines. The last two lines telling us, sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. In what way has the soldier died, the kamikaze pilot? Well, if he'd gone and done what he was supposed to do in his suicide mission, the pilot typically crashing the plane into any given target, then he would have died in honour of his country, doing what was expected of him, his duty. But here we have this more, let's call it an existential death. His body is living, but because of his being treated as a pariah, P-R-A, I can't spell, so that I'll start again, P-A-R-I-A-H, P-A-R-I-A-H, a pariah, because of his being treated as a pariah, he's sort of metaphorically dead. He is not living. And that kind of captures the meaning of the poem in many respects. That's what Kamikaze is about. So what's the beef? If I finish with that, we're being shown here about the destructive impacts, the destructive result of patriotism. We can see it on his family and how they have to respond to it. We can see it in his relationship with his children and his wife, in so much as there is no longer a relationship with them, because as those children grow older, they learn to socially distance their father from them. Maybe a second beef would be that we can see how in the soldier's decision to preserve life, he brings shame. And maybe the third one, and why this fits into our group of power and conflict poems, is that this is a poem about the power and the beauty of nature, and how it forces a man who is indoctrinated into thinking that he must honour his country, that instead he should serve to protect and save his own life. And so as you're thinking about this, and as you're hearing this, what you should be doing is thinking, well, what are the poems that I can compare this to? If I'm looking at a poem to do with, if I'm looking at Kamikaze, with regards to nature and the power of nature, what are the poems that I can use there? If I'm looking at this poem in terms of inner conflict, the inner conflict that the soldier would feel as a consequence of his decision, what are the poems that I can look at there? If we're looking at this as a poem about how it affects people, well, what are the other poems in the group of 15 that are about how conflict affects people? That's about it. There are loads more videos on this particular YouTube channel, and loads more videos on the internet itself on the poem of Kamikaze. Take a look at them, use them, and make sure that as you're listening to this, make the annotations. And doing that will ensure that you've got a reasonably strong base on which to build moving forward.